This is Ari Koretzky, and welcome to Jews You Should Know, introducing the broader community to interesting and inspiring Jewish men and women making a difference in our world. Some are already famous, some not yet so, but each is a Jew you should know.
And we are back, finally, with another episode of Jews You Should Know, a very special and very different episode, our 200th episode. And yes, I know it has been a very long break over the summer. We did not record. I actually did record a bunch of interviews, but we did not release anything. I just needed a little bit of a break to catch up on the rest of my life and also to evaluate kind of where we are in this podcast. This is our 200th episode. Nice big round number and a really good time for reflection on what the podcast has been, is, and maybe where it's going. And for that reason, I actually asked a wonderful friend and a prolific podcaster in his own right, Rabbi Dr. Dovid Bashevkin, who is the host of the podcast 1840, which also is sort of a multimedia enterprise with a YouTube channel and lots of writings and a whole community that's emerged around it. And Dovid and I have become friends over the years and through our shared interest in Jewish outreach, but also just general Jewish events and podcasting in particular. He was a guest on my podcast, for those who recall, quite early on, well before he even started the 1840 project, which has become a huge centerpiece of his life since. And then subsequently, I was on his podcast in a unique way, interviewing him on his podcast so that his audience could learn a little bit more about his process, his goals, and sort of the inside baseball of 1840. Well, we subsequently, again, began discussing him coming on our podcast, Jews You Should Know, to do the same thing. But rather than have him just come and interview me about my life story and so forth, I really wanted Dovid to challenge me, to force me to think boldly about what this podcast is, where it's at in its history, because nothing lasts forever or needs to last forever, and really helping me evaluate or reevaluate where we are in this process. So Dovid came on and, true to form, was really well prepared and quite powerful in his questioning. He did not pull punches, which was great. I really wanted that. I wanted the opportunity to think about this critically, even though this is the podcast itself, and maybe it's a little bit ironic, but I felt that would be the best and most authentic way of approaching this subject, while also hopefully giving my listeners a little bit of a window into me as a host, which I don't often do on the podcast. I really much more focus on the guests, as I assume you know. In any event, there's no grand conclusions from the podcast. It got me thinking. I do believe that moving forward, I do have quite a few other episodes that I've already recorded, and I will be releasing those, but maybe at more of a slower clip as I continue to think about possibly working on some of the other projects that are referenced in this podcast discussion. And I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities on the horizon, in addition to everything else that I'm doing in my life. So stay tuned for some of those, and I hope you enjoy this really open, transparent conversation with Dovid about my process, about my thoughts on this podcast, and what the state of Jewish podcasting is in the fall of 2023. So thank you for listening ahead of time, and as always, a reminder to follow us on social media at Jews You Should Know, spelled out fully, on Instagram, Facebook, Jews You Should Know with the letter U, on Twitter, now X. That's how long it's been since I've actually released an episode. The transition from Twitter to X took place in that interim. Please remind others to follow. And if you're not doing so, please do so yourself. Follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other platform. And now to my conversation, and really the interview of me by Dovid Bashevkin.
It is my absolute privilege and pleasure to return a favor to a dear friend who interviewed me and remains, I believe, the best interview of myself that I've ever been subject to. Always comes incredibly prepared with incredibly incisive questions, which is why it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to the Jews You Should Know audience your beloved host, who I, your dearest friend, Dovid Bashevkin, a former guest of Jews You Should Know. You may have heard your guest interview of me on my 1840 podcast. It is my absolute privilege and pleasure to introduce your normal host, but today's guest, Rabbi Ari Koretzky.
How you doing, Dovid? Thank you so much for coming on. And this is fun. This is a treat for me. I feel like we can pretty much end it right there. You buttered up my ego. I'm good to go.
We're done.
Have a good night.
Dayenu. No, you really are an incredibly gifted interviewer, and I want to talk about some of your interviewing process. But I really want to start with Jews You Should Know, because people do not know. There's a lot people should know about Jews You Should Know, the podcast itself. My opening question that I've always asked, and I always forget, you've probably answered it for me before. When did you start, and most importantly, why did you start the Jews You Should Know podcast?
It's a great question, and I think about it sometimes myself. I think it was about 2017 when I actually started, but I had the idea for a little while before that. I remember telling people, I'd kind of just discovered what podcasts were, 2015, 2016. Like many millions of other Americans, I got hooked on the Serial podcast. And that got me excited about, I happen to love true crime in general, which maybe we could psychoanalyze at some point. But
no, my dream, you should know, is to do a Jewish true crime podcast. I have a list of unsolved Jewish crime mysteries, some more modern, some quite a bit older. It would be my absolute dream. We should tag team on that one day. We'll put that on the bucket list.
I'll tell you, though, some people have joked with me that, I should interview like some of like the nefarious characters in the Jewish world. Be like, Jews you shouldn't know.
I think that's the 1840 podcast. We already have a Jews
It depends on the episode,
you shouldn't know. Every anonymous episode. Jews you should not cross to the other side of the street. But tell me, you started in 2017, most importantly, and you started before nearly everyone else, something that I know I want to talk to you more about. But why did you start this? You had a thriving career as an outreach professional. You were associated with, I believe, Meor and the University of Maryland campus. Was that not enough work for you? Was this because you were bored? You needed another outlet? You needed another audience? Why did you begin this?
It's funny. My wife would hear this and laugh, I'm sure, because taking on extra jobs is something of an addiction of mine. But look, I think there's we'll call it in yeshiva parlance, there's a low lishma and a lishma. There's a more of a self-absorbed or self-interested reason, and there was perhaps a more elevated reason. From a perspective of self-interest, it was this remarkable opportunity to satisfy my voyeuristic impulse, right? To be able to meet and speak with people who otherwise would not talk to me, or would not talk to me for more than 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it might be. And all of a sudden they're sitting down and opening up their heart to me in the most revelatory fashion, the most transparent way. Something about the podcast medium, and we joked about this, I think, when we spoke, and the Saturday Night Live skit that you once referenced on your show, about how the podcast all of a sudden creates this dynamic between two people where they're having real conversation and conversation they never would have otherwise. And so this gave me a kind of access, an inside look to people that I respected and I thought were, fascinating, and I wanted to learn about and learn from. I shared this on my 100th episode that my original kind of white whale for the show was going to be, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who I know was meant to come on 1840 before he got sick again.
Yes. And he was booked, but we had him booked in a day, but he had to push it off because he went on to the Tim Ferriss podcast, which, look, gets several million views every week. Yes,
but I'll bet you have more Jewish listeners, David, or at least more Orthodox Jewish listeners. So, although we can discuss that another time. But anyway, so we, I tried actually to book him, and the office kind of pushed me off and said, he's booked through 2019 or something like that, which at the time was several years away. And I was really dissuaded by that. And actually, because of that disappointment, I stopped trying to make the podcast. And I pushed it off a year or two. I can't remember exactly, because I felt, the people that I want to speak to don't want to speak to me. And I subsequently learned that that's not true. There are individuals that are like that. And there are still, some great guests that continue to evade me. But by and large, many people were willing to talk to me. And once I actually made a more earnest effort to try, accessing more than one guest, I found they would. So that was kind of on the self-interested perspective. On the, I guess, more elevated or more aspirational, idealistic kind of level, I've been working, as you said now, the University of Maryland, Form R, which is a division of Olami, and I deal with outreach and work with amazing students. And thank God my my career, so to speak, now is busier than it's ever been. It's beyond busy. But I felt that, I would bring in different speakers to talk to college students. And in a room, you would have 20, 30, 70 students. And I said, wouldn't it be amazing if the wider Jewish world could hear from some of these people and learn from them? Why is it limited? Why is it confined to this finite number that happens to be sitting here, that happens to attend, the Harvard of Maryland, University of Maryland of College Park? What's going on over there? So I thought if I could introduce those kinds of personalities to a broader array of people within the community and across the Jewish community, not only in the deeply affiliated corners thereof, but other parts of the community as well, the broader spectrum. I thought that would be a beautiful, beautiful opportunity. And so I ventured to do that. Whether I've been successful or not, is not for me to answer.
Well, we'll get to measuring your own success. I do appreciate kind of the latter reason why you gave. There are so many people who come in to speak to, I don't know, you call them the broader community. I don't know if that's a euphemism. You're talking about, outreach is usually in the non-Orthodox community who are college students, and there are people who come in, look to inspire, and you can reach so much more. I'll be honest with you, the first reason you said, again, you were the first to it. I find it, it's one of my pet peeves almost, like, because people sometimes reach out to me and say, hey, can I interview you for my podcast? And I've actually been on the air with other podcasts, not yours, and I'm just like, what is this for? Like, is this just like because, you wanted just to talk to me? You could have just asked for a 20-minute phone call, 15-minute phone call. I don't find that to be a compelling reason at all, but I do find outreach to be an incredibly compelling reason to kind of show people, introduce people to Jews who they should know, which is exactly the title. Which brings me to really the second question, which we actually thought about when you interviewed me for 1840, which is the demographic. It was the question I remember you asked me, which was, why do I translate so often? Aren't most of your listeners Orthodox? Now, I fought back pretty hard. I've never been so, I think, confrontational to a question. If you listen, I got pretty worked up. And I believe that I was true because, many of our listeners are not Orthodox. I do believe there's not a reason to put up needless language barriers. But I'm curious, in your mind, who is the ideal listener of Jews You Should Know, and who are the actual listeners of Jews You Should Know?
It's another great question, Dovid. And look, originally, I probably imagined a lot of, let's say, Jewishly connected in some level, Jewishly affiliated, but not necessarily observant or Orthodox Jews who would stumble across it because they type in the word Jew or Jews or whatever it might be into their podcast feed. I did not anticipate promoting it tremendously among college students, though I think that it would gain more traction with college students than it probably has. What I found is actually I have more probably college students' parents listening than the students themselves, I think because of the nature of the conversations, where people are in their lives, and so forth. Now, that all being said, I also ended up having a lot more affiliated listeners or Orthodox listeners, to be more explicit, just because I think that it's low-hanging fruit in terms of any content you're going to put out there in the public square. Those who are already most drawn to Jewish media, to Jewish inspiration, whatever you might call it, are also going to be drawn to whatever is being put out there, unless it's really offensive or, controversial. Like 1840, I'm kidding. But, unless it's, something that's really off-putting. But if it's, wholesome, clean-cut Jewish entertainment, so to speak, and interesting content. So you're going to have, by definition, a highly affiliated crowd. And so I found that a lot of people end up being, in that demographic. I'm certainly, most of the times that I'm stopped by people or whatever, or when I hear from people, it's usually from more affiliated people. It's definitely an amazing ego boost. David, maybe, I don't know how you feel about it, but I love when somebody stops me and says, "Oh, yeah, raspy voice from that Jews You Should Know." Happened to me. I was at a falafel shop in Denver, Colorado. Shout out to Daniel. I won't give his full name, but from your neck of the woods, actually. And he was sitting schmoozing with some students, and he said, I recognized that voice and he came over. That the amount of street cred I got from in front of my students with that little cameo there, that little fan club there was amazing. So I think there's been invariably a lot of Orthodox listeners just because that's who ends up often consuming and looking for this kind of content. But that's okay.
Is that okay? I want to push back on you, and I want to push back quite strongly. Is that okay, or you were kind of just pivoting to the lowest hanging fruits of who's anyways consuming content? And in some ways, is there a part of you that feels that the intended original mission was not successful? Meaning, if the original dream was to introduce people to Jews you should know, it's in the title. That means there are Jews out there who you would not have otherwise have heard of, have interacted with, which I think baked in there is addressing an audience, Orthodox or not Orthodox, but one that is less affiliated. Do you feel like you've been successful in introducing Jews who would otherwise not have known or heard about other Jews to them?
Yeah, so let's take it in two directions. Number one, there's no question that I wish that the audience was larger in all segments. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, like you mentioned earlier, this is like not my first job, not my second job. It's not even really my third or fourth job. I do it so on the margins of my life that I don't have, funding and a whole operations team.
And I just want to state, because of anybody listening on this, aside from the fact that we happen to be great friends, I certainly admire you a great deal. And as I said in the beginning, I really think you are one of the best interviewers. But I need to live up to those interviewing standards, so I'm not pulling any punches.
Baby, push.
I'm going to ask a couple of tough questions.
I love it.
But before we get to the size, I want to talk about the intended demographic.
Yeah, so I would say not to the degree that I would like, and that does dovetail with the notion of size as well. But I'll get back to that. But I think a lot of it just owes to the fact that I don't have a marketing team. I don't have, I'm not a marketer professionally. I don't have time to promote it, vociferously on social media. I don't have graphics. In other words, it was really started and continued to be a mom and pop, basically a one-man show. I had some help for a little while with an editor and things like that. But to get to that kind of reach would require a more coordinated effort and bring in some skills from other professionals and other people that I don't, possess myself. And so, yes, I think that has not achieved that. Now, is it sort of revisionistic or sort of an expression of cognitive dissonance to say that many of the people that ended up gaining, I actually learned something powerful about, which is that there's lots of Jews within the Orthodox community that could use inspiration and that could use an introduction to unique personalities that they wouldn't come across because they're working so hard and they're living their lives and they're going to Minyan and doing Shabbos and all those things, but aren't necessarily hearing these kinds of inspirational characters. Yes, I believe that I discovered that as well, and that everyone needs that kind of and again, inspiration, whatever word you want to use. And now one could say that's really kind of, moving the goalposts, so to speak. And that could be correct. And again, these are not mutually exclusive goals theoretically. It's just that if you're doing something in a way that you don't have a massive promotional operation behind you, in this very kind of difficult world of indie podcasting, so to speak. So, oftentimes your audience is going to be organic and beyond kind of your discretion. So I do feel pleased that I'm able to engage an audience that already has other opportunities Jewishly, and this is kind of a different sort of opportunity, and it allows me to have that voice and that outlet in that part of the community that professionally I'm not engaged with. But yes, of course, would I like the entire broader Jewish world to be listening and college students on campuses across North America and so forth? Yes, obviously I would love that goal, and if the right person is there to help partner to make that happen, then I'm here to engage.
I want to come back to that because I actually do believe, I am of the opinion that if you redesign the very bones of the podcast with the audience in mind first, I think you could still capture them. But I do want to talk about the other opportunities, and I want to talk about something that I think podcast hosts rarely talk about, but you have a front row seat to. And that is, you were the first on the market. You're 2017. Most of the other large Jewish podcasts, maybe with the exception of Unorthodox, which is run by Tablet, which I think is a little bit older than you. But a lot of the Orthodox entry into the podcast space began 2019, 2020 during COVID, and you saw an explosion of other podcasts. Forget about 1840. We're not even the league leader. There are others that are even wider, Meaningful People, Inspiration for the Nation. You have this explosion of podcasting, and here you are getting a front row to other podcasts that are taking more or less. 1840 is a little bit of a different structure. I'm not here to plug my podcast, but other podcasts that are nearly identical to your structure and how you do things, and you see them explode in the Orthodox world. Now, I've been on every Jewish podcast that's on my bucket list.
Despite your protestations otherwise, you also aspire to
be on every single known Jewish podcast. I've been on all of them, and they're all wonderful. But I've said consistently, you are the best interviewer. You come the most prepared with the best questions, and I really appreciate the way you approach it. I want to know, and I want to say the word outright, how do you deal with jealousy? How do you deal with the fact that you were the first to the market and you are watching people copy your exact formula? Shows that if you swapped out the name Jews You Should Know, it would be the exact same podcast. You couldn't call 1840 Jews You Should Know, but there are a lot of other straight interview shows. You could call them Jews You Should Know. That's basically what they're doing. They are putting up big numbers. I want to know, first and foremost, do you have feelings of jealousy, and how do you deal with them as a content creator?
Yeah, so number one, the answer is absolutely yes. 100%. I'm a human being. And obviously when I see people that are younger than me and came in later than me and sometimes taking the same exact guest and sometimes not, which we could talk about guest selection as well. But of course, there's feelings of jealousy at times. Look, it is greatly buffeted, so to speak, by the fact that, like I said before, this is not even remotely my day job, and that I have a very, very full and rich life built around a career that I'm very passionate about, more than a career, a calling, really, and as well as, my family and other wonderful pursuits in my life. And that certainly, I think, softens that blow, for sure. If this was my, raison d'etre, then I would certainly feel quite a bit more covetous, so to speak. That being said, yes, of course I feel that way. Look, at the end of the day, I also recognize that there is a difference between what I'm doing and what they're doing on a number of fronts. First of all, those are full-time professional media operations. Jews You Should Know is not. Jews You Should Know at the end of the day is me talking to a microphone to people that I find compelling most of the time. Occasionally not. But, most of the time that people that I find compelling and interesting and of note and of worthiness to present to the broader Jewish arena. That's number one. And so I have to recognize an apples and oranges quality to that, in the sense that when you are competing, quote unquote, with a fully funded professional media operation, of course, that is going to be a difference in outcomes as well. Look, at the end of the day, I like to think I'm offering something a little bit different on a few fronts. The kinds of guests that I'm willing or interested in bringing in are definitely different. I'm not only interested in the quote unquote Orthodox Jewish celebrity. In fact, in some ways that interests me the least of all kinds of guests. I like to surface other voices, whether they're Orthodox or not. If they're lesser known, or even if they're well known, perhaps they're not coming because of their religious, inspirational qualities, but because of things that they're doing in general for the Jewish people or for the
Give me an example
world.
of a guest you have that, looking back, would not have worked on one of the.
I mean, you could look at my list. Probably the vast majority of them, I would guess, or at least half of them. One of my favorite guests of all time, who's now actually become more of a household name. It was an amazing interview. It was an amazing experience. I did a summer of maybe 2019. I can't remember. It was before COVID. I did a tour in Israel, and I interviewed 25 people in 2 weeks and released live. And I released those slowly over the year. And one of the places I went was to the home of Doron Almog. Doron Almog was the first soldier to land, to get off the plane in Entebbe, in the raid on Entebbe. He was an amazing, military hero. He was the chief, the general of the Southern Command in Israel. But he also had a son who was severely autistic and didn't know what to do with him, and learned subsequently that there was a very shameful past within Israeli society of actually some very prominent Israeli leaders who had sort of shunted away their own special needs children, in some ways spirited them off to other countries, or otherwise kind of institutionalized them and did not, incorporate them into their lives. And he was determined to do something different, and he became an integral part of the Ali Negev village and raised millions of dollars for them. And today he is. This is subsequent to our interview. Today is the chair of the Dochnut, and he's a very, very prominent player in Israeli politics, Israeli diaspora affairs, and all those kinds of things. He is a secular, quote unquote, Jew in Israel. I was almost in tears, and my wife was in tears. She actually was there with me on a rare occasion at his home listening to him, and we've remained friends, and I WhatsApping back and forth, and like will only happen in Israel. I went to visit a farm for Shemitah that actually our mutual mentor friend, Rabbi Ari Bergman, had sent me up with this farmer to go and visit during the Shemitah, the sabbatical year. And I went to this farmer, and I'm schmoozing with him, and we start talking, and he tells me this army commander was Doron Almog. So we took out a selfie and sent it over to him, and, they still have their group chat from 35 years ago. Only in Israel, you get a simple farmer out there doing Shemitah, and the head of, the Jewish agency, and they were army buddies, who saw action together. But in any event, a guest like that would not, I don't think, even considered for other podcasts. Again, I'm not casting aspersions. Every podcast has its own demographic, its own identity. If I could distinguish, I think a lot of the other podcasts, and they're doing wonderful things. What they're doing is they're kind of riding that wave of Jewish celebrity culture, room celebrity culture, really, which is, it's become this cultural phenomenon as the Orthodox community has ascended in strength and become very self-assured and very powerful. It's developed its own celebrity culture, singers and speakers and all of those kinds of things. And I don't decry that. I do decry that a little bit, let me be honest. But I don't, if I'm being really honest. But if I step back from it, I can appreciate it, because every society needs culture. Culture is integral, right? It is kind of the padding of Jewish life. You can't just have, straight ritual, straight, religious observance. You need to live in a broader society, and that, so to the degree that you have your own independent, authentically religious sort of culture, I think that's helpful for people and keeps people, connected to the deeper ideals. Sometimes I find it a drop superficial, kind of like the soundbite sort of Judaism, and it doesn't always appeal to me. Sometimes it appeals to me, but I understand a tremendous need for it, and I think there's a mass appeal there. And so besides the promotional quality of these media outlets, I think there also is an appeal to maybe it's an easier listen or just a more natural listen for people that are marinating their entire lives in these kinds of personalities, in these kinds of circles and so forth. I'm having different conversations, using different vocabulary very often. I mean, my son had a friend in yeshiva. Sometimes you get when your child's friend is listening, and that's like very exciting, because then you look cool to your children. But he's listening. He says, when I want a good listen, I listen to podcasts. When I want to, improve my vocabulary, I listen to Jews You Should Know. So I took that as a compliment, because I pride myself on my my sesquipedalian nature. And, I enjoy that. Whether it's an ego thing, probably is.
And you even know how to pronounce the words. I use big words, but I don't know how to pronounce them.
That's because you're a consummate autodidact of it, but that's the pitfall of any autodidact. I can list you some of the great rabbis I know who fall into the same category. And sometimes I listen to their shir and I want to, kind of send an email with a pronunciation. But, it's fine. I enjoy that. It's definitely ego gratifying. But I think it's serving a different kind of need. Is it a narrower need? Is it a less popular or less exciting or less accessible kind of offering? Perhaps. It's hard to know, what's a function of promotion and so forth, and what's a function of the content itself.
Well, I hope by the end of this we can at least sort a little bit of that through. I think one of the things that we really need to parse apart is you've mentioned a few times already the fact that this is not your first, second, third, or fourth job. This is your fifth job. And it needs to be an afterthought. I am not sympathetic to that as an excuse, I'll be honest with you. I think anything that you put out there, it's like somebody getting up to speak in shul, and right away at the beginning of the speech, they commit what I think is a cardinal sin of creating content. I had no time to prepare.
Well, but Delvin, let me push back on that. I would distinguish in the following way. I would distinguish between the quality of the content and its ability to be promoted, because those are two different things in my mind. If you're putting out a quality product that you stand behind, you're proud of, I think is very important to do. Now, you tell me it requires a certain amount of effort or funding or whatever it might be to then get that more broadly circulated, so that I could say, look, I don't have either the time or the money or whatever it might be in order to do that. I see a strong distinction there.
Okay, I respectfully disagree. I think that there's something a little bit more fundamental in aligning the demographic, the medium, and the message. But I appreciate the fact that this is not your first job. But I do want to dig deeper into the differences between podcasting and the contemporary world of outreach. How do you approach, and what are the differences in the ways that you approach creating content live for your students on college campus? What are their needs, and how does it differ from the way you conceive and develop content for your podcast audience? How are those Jewish needs different?
I think my mindset is very different in a way between the two. When I'm dealing on a college campus, it's a very, very personal endeavor. And in many ways, the abstract or the intellectual or the theological even almost is secondary to the personal connection. And the personal relationship really is the primary mechanism through which, everything else flows after that. Because we're dealing in relatively small numbers, let's say in hundreds, and because the people are in front of us, and because they're appearing in, whether it's one-on-one or in small seminars or things of that nature, it's an entirely different, manner of connecting and disseminating Jewish wisdom, Jewish content, and so forth.
Dig a drop deeper. So what is the Jewish content you are putting before them? You have that audience of 100. The relationship is there. At some point, you want to share with them Jewishly. How does that Jewish content differ from the Jewish messaging that you try to develop on Jews?
So honestly, very often it's much more basic. That's first of all. In other words, when I'm speaking to a student, most students that I'm working with today know very, very little about basic Judaism. And we've talked about this before, in our own private conversations about the power of getting back to basics and how that's often overlooked and underappreciated. I get frustrated. There's so much pedantry and so much, bickering in the Jewish world over like these infinitesimally small minutia of distinctions. And like the average Jew in today's world doesn't know what Shavuos is. Has never sat in a sukkah, doesn't know who Abraham was, right? Let's stop and can we just talk basic Judaism to people? Again, when you're only in a tiny little, when you live life in a very, very narrow sphere, then you're never going to have those conversations. But when you are quickly exposed to people across the spectrum of Jewish life, you're going to discover that those are the conversations you need to have first. So any Jewish wisdom that we're beginning with is just, first of all, it's personal. It's speaking to the person, where they are in their own lives, where they're going, what their dreams and aspirations are, how Judaism can inform that. And that's a very different kind of conversation that obviously cannot be had in a broad medium. And again, the general tenor of the concepts that we're conveying are much more basic. When I'm talking to a guest on the podcast, I'm already starting at a much higher, so to speak, quote unquote, intellectual position. I'm taking a lot of things for granted, even if I'm translating, but I'm not going back to the most rudimentary foundations of every Jewish, idea. And most of the time, we're not even talking about Judaism per se, as much as we're talking about them as a person and their embodiment thereof. It's a higher level intellectual conversation, which might be why a lot of students aren't necessarily listening to it, because maybe it's over their head, or it's just, not giving them the very, very basics that, they might need.
If one of your students asked you and said, "Hey, Rabbi, I heard you run a podcast. I'm interested in listening to a podcast I run every day. What podcast would you recommend that I listen to?" One of your students. Does that podcast exist? And if so, what podcast?
It's a phenomenal question. It's a question that's been bandied about by people like myself, outreach professionals and so forth, and people like yourself for quite a while. And the reality is there is a dearth both of those entry-level podcasts, A, and B, again, like anything else, as you know, as someone who is so prolific in the media space, in the social media space, there is content creation and there's distribution. And distributing to this demographic, which is not naturally there. They're not sitting together in shul waiting to be delivered to read the shul newsletter that says, listen to this podcast. There's no easy way to access them. That is also, the $1 million question. I think a lot of institutions, Aish is trying to, attack this. Yes, I'm going to. But therefore, I would not recommend my own if they were looking for a tutorial in basic Judaism, for example. Yaakov Volby, for example, who's been doing this even a lot longer than I have. He's created 6 or 7 podcasts that are just going through basic Jewish history, going through the Torah, going through, the stories, those kinds of things. My colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Rick Fox, and his colleague, Mayor Beer, they created, what does Judaism say about, and they just go through different topics. That's much more informationally interesting for a beginner student. However, maybe it's less entertaining. And often people are looking not only to learn straight content, they want to hear stories. They want to bring it alive through the lived experience of real people. And so that's a different mode of learning. I'm not educating in sort of a frontal way, so to speak. I'm not teaching about Jewish holidays and things like that. I'm teaching through the osmosis of hearing people's stories.
Why have you never created the Jews You Should Know and literally interviewing your own students around the country with the help and backing of Olami, which is this national massive organization that is touching outreach throughout the country, and say, I want to wed the interview, the entertainment with the basics. I want to do a 25-minute interview with somebody talking and being introduced to Shavuos for the first time, and then coupled with it, meaning, is there ever a point where you feel like you would say, mission accomplished, we did something really good and really special, but now it is time to deeply reinvent what I am doing? I know I've experienced this. I did a column for Mishpacha magazine for many years. I loved it. Top 5. I was the badchin for the yeshiva community, putting out jokes. And there came a point where I felt a little stuck in the medium, and I felt there came a point where, I said what I needed to say, but anything I go further is I'm just reaching in and kind of selling, the same spoiled, recycled goods, and I need something new, and I didn't feel that newness. And I'm curious for you, at what point, if ever, will you say it is time to fully reinvent what I'm doing?
It's a fabulous question. Look, and I think I have the luxury of considering that question because my livelihood doesn't depend on this, right? So that is a benefit. I'm entirely open to that. And look, I think you're describing a different podcast. I wouldn't even call it wedding the two as much as I would call it.
Exactly. There
is content that is waiting to be created by somebody. Now, whether that has to be Ari Koretzky or somebody else, I don't believe I don't have the, sufficient enough of a messianic complex to believe that it has to be me. You know what I mean? It could be Dovid Bashevkin. It could be lots of other people. I'm doing a lot of different things. The question would be, what would I take away in order to do something like that? And that would be require a real cheshbon hanefesh, a real inner searching, because it's not simple. It's not simple at all, given, where we're at in terms of where we position ourselves as an outreach organization and the kinds of things we're doing and the numbers we're reaching within what we're doing. It's really not a simple question. To replace this with that, in theory, I'm open to it. And I don't feel like this is like an inexhaustible wellspring of capacity. There definitely are times where I feel like, who's going to be that next great guest that really inspires me? Am I really that interested in the next person I'm interviewing? Not always, and of course, then there's always those white whales out there. They're like, if or when I could meet that person, that would make the whole thing worthwhile. Yeah.
I've said it before. I may have said it when you interviewed me. Sometimes the greatest nightmare is being given your own dreams. My partner and everything that I've done in 1840 is Mitch Eichen. And when he gave me the ability, a very extraordinarily generous sum of money to start it, but not enough that I could just kind of coast and, have a full-time, I don't have any full-time employees or anything like that. But it was a nightmare, and the reason why it was a nightmare is because the only person I got to blame for the relative success or failure of the initiative was now myself, and that's a terrifying position. I no longer got to say, when I first started, it was my third, fourth job. I do a lot of things, but it's really at the center and the heart of what I do, and I'm not able to lean on anything else. And I kind of wonder for you, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to restart start from scratch, zero-based budgeting, without any other preconceived notion, to restart a podcast, take all the time that you're putting into this and start from scratch, what are you doing with that time?
It's an important question. I haven't thought about it enough, to be honest. I do believe that whatever I would do, it would not replace what I'm currently doing already. In other words, I feel so passionately about what I'm doing right now and so energized by it. My team has been growing and we're just doing some extraordinarily exciting things and really touching people in just a profound way that it wouldn't replace it. If anything, it would allow me perhaps to build out a team of which I could be a part and think innovatively and creatively about creating content and then reaching people and helping, get these kinds of other messages out there and this kind of educational programming or content out there. And I would again, certainly open to that kind of a suggestion. And, if this was to be construed as an offer, Dovid, yes, that in theory, yes, but it would not replace what I'm doing. And therefore it would be part of a collaborative effort with other talented people, I believe.
Do you ever, and this I'm asking both in a Kiruv setting and on the podcast, do you ever find your Orthodox affiliation stifling in the types of topics that you really deep down want to talk about and the types of people you really deep down want to interview?
Look, there's no question that there have been guests whose sensibilities, whether religious or political or otherwise, have not fully aligned with mine, to say the least. And there have been even rare instances where I've had to edit out certain things that I found particularly offensive on such a core level that I felt it would be derelict to myself, to my own integrity, and to the audience to present that. That doesn't normally happen. Again, the focus generally is biographical, and the goal generally is it's not a gotcha kind of podcast. So I'm not pushing people in a way to sort of expose the...
Except when you interview me.
That's only because you basically asked for it, David.
It was fantastic.
It's not it's not fellow journalism. I'm trying to really draw out the best parts of people. And so when you try to see the best in others and you try to highlight the best in others, that's usually what ends up happening. So no, it doesn't really. And in fact, the opposite. I love the fact that on a personal level, I can become that sort of ambassador. It's one of my great passions. Maybe it's a little Pollyannish. I probably am, but I love the concept of being able to speak with these people who are very different and to walk away building friendships and feeling a real sense of connection. I absolutely love that. And for some reason, I'm like a bageling magnet. I have that about me that people, different kinds of Jews, love to just talk to me.
Well, you're really infectious, and I think you're one of the few people I've met who seems to be a legitimate extrovert, meaning you get energy from talking and speaking.
Yeah, it's interesting because people get to know me really well, and they see me in other moments, see that I have a very strong sort of quieter side, which shocks people. But I do get, kind of after a lot of engagement with people, I do like to withdraw and read and things like that. But people, it takes a lot to see that. I definitely do get a lot of energy from certain kinds of interactions with people. That's for sure. I was just in the airport, and a guy comes over to me. I said, "Oh, you left your wallet in the bin over there. Thank you so much." And, early Chag Sameach, it's like, boom, Then I'm on the plane and this guy turns next to me and he goes to the back. He's in the window seat. He's got to go to the bathroom, comes back and he goes, "How do you say thank you in Hebrew?" And he heads up, and we have a whole discussion. I'm constantly having that. For some reason, I'm drawing that. I think people, kind of just feel safe doing that.
Who are your interview role models? I remember, we did 2 episodes together, one where you came on to 1840, and the first one when I came on to Jews You Should Know, and you asked me a question that I wish more people had asked, but you're the only one who really tried to thread the needle, and I remember you asked me a question. What connected my work? I wrote a book called Synagogue, Sin and Failure in Jewish Thought. I'm plugging my own book on your podcast. God should bless you. And I also wrote this humor column for Mishpacha magazine, later published as a book called Top 5. And you had asked me, what is the connection between your fascination with failure and humor and comedy? They seem to be totally disparate topics. And I thought it was a very incisive question and really allowed me to kind of unpack and share in ways that I hadn't anywhere else. I was curious when you asked me that, what is your preparation process and who are your interview Rabbeim. Like, I've learned from the non-Jewish podcasts. My Rabbeim, my teachers, my mentors, are Howard Stern and Conan O'Brien.
I hope a later iteration of Howard Stern and not the earlier one.
The later, yes. PG-13 Howard Stern, not the early, immature Howard Stern. But I have what to say on early, immature Howard Stern also. If you watch his first interview on E!, his first guest ever was Gary Shandling,
your hero,
who I
yes.
happened to be my hero, who I'm obsessed with. And Gary totally unpacks and deconstructs his Narishkeit, which I think had him kind of turn and become a little bit more of a thoughtful, mature interviewer. But I've always been enamored with them. I'm curious for you, who are your interview role models and what is your preparation process?
Like, I'll be honest with you. So this might sound, I don't want to sound arrogant or anything like that, to the degree that I have a natural talent for it. I don't have a lot of interview role models. I do enjoy, Dan Patrick is known as the great interviewer in the sports world. And, I've listened to him many times, and I am a sports fan. Larry King was known as the great political interviewer and so forth. Dovid doesn't think so, but he's known in that way.
No, I just love my favorite Larry King, because I share the clip many times, is his interview after Jerry Seinfeld went off the air, where he asked Seinfeld, did you step away or were you canceled? And Jerry just goes to the canceled? I was the #1 show on television. It's my favorite little exchange between Larry King and Jerry Seinfeld. Is what I shared when people asked if my Mishpacha column got cut. I said, cut? We were the #1 column.
Look, I believe that good interviewing, like good relationship building, has a lot mostly to do with the quality of active listening. I think people in today's world, as much of a talker and a schmoozer and an extrovert as I am, I think, again, it sounds so self-important and self-referential, and I don't like it. But the reality is I think I'm a good listener when I'm in that mode and really deeply listening to what the person's saying and thinking in the moment, like, does this cohere? Does this make sense to me? Does this fit with other things I know about this person or what they said earlier? And I'm really genuinely like in the moment with that person. And then when I combine that with just being a naturally kind of curious student of life and thinking about life in general, so I'm interested in these people. I'm genuinely interested in them, whether they're selling, automobiles or they're a rabbi or they're whatever they do, and I'm truly interested. And so I think the combination of genuine curiosity and true active listening, like deep internalizing of another person's being, of another person's story, that allows for powerful interviewing, irrespective, if I could use that perhaps incorrect word, of any techniques or tactics. Obviously, you have to have some capacity to engage in conversation and a sense of timing and a sense of articulation. But that ability, that empathic ability and that genuine curiosity, I really think are the magical combination as an interviewer.
Ari, I am so fascinated by you, and I really am, despite my line of questioning, so impressed with your work, with your tenacity, with your infectiousness. We have shared so many kind of voice notes back and forth about the work that we share, overlap, critique, feedback, encouragement, enthusiasm. I really do consider you a friend, even though we've only met less than a handful of times in person. And I really do admire your work quite a bit, even though, and it's really a testament to my esteem for you, even though I do believe that you should fully reinvent Jews You Should Know, which is a crazy thing to say, closing out a Jews You Should Know interview. But I believe that with my heart and soul. It's my esteem for your work. I think your talent is too important to kind of be like, oh, this is my 4th or 5th job, so like, take what you can get. I think you should channel your strengths and your energy to something that should be justified on its own merits, regardless whether it's your 5th job, 6th job, or 100th job.
So, David, let me turn it around on you then. What do you think is missing in this world of Jewish podcasting? What do you think is that unique voice that potentially I or others like me could add? And where are those where are those gaps? Where are those voids?
I am very, very critical about the way the larger Kiruv world, I mean, we shared some criticisms about the Orthodox world, kind of bumper sticker celebrity culture inside the Orthodox world. I have all of those reservations. I would add on to them some of the stuckness that I found in the larger outreach world about how they think about content and putting out content. I think it is a I don't want to use the word damning again. We don't want
Darning. Was it darning, Kevin?
to darning. I was absolutely shocked that Tablet Magazine, who I love and worked for, I shared this publicly, was the first to give a taste of Daf Yomi to a mass audience. Everybody's sleeping at the wheel, and Tablet Magazine comes ahead and builds a daily Daf Yomi program by Leah Leibovitz that has, 4,000 to 5,000 daily listeners. Like what happened? We convinced ourselves that we could only share, the pristine Talmud, but it was shocking to me. And I think there are people who are a little asleep at the wheel. I don't think you are included among them, but I think what is missing is there is a big gap between kind of the Orthodox world, which likes to tell stories in completion of somebody who kind of traversed the gap from a assimilated, secular, or less affiliated life into a fully Orthodox life. We like telling those stories of Baalei Tshuva, as they are known, but we very rarely highlight the story at the very beginning, a third of the way through, a fifth of the way through. And I think so much of your talents could be geared towards highlighting the story, the very early journey with the vulnerability. And I think the reason why we don't hear these stories is people are afraid because we don't know how they're going to turn out, and we don't know how they're going to resolve. I think we should be less afraid of telling those stories. And I think it's people like you. I would love to listen to you interview college students, people of different ages beginning to take a journey, to take a step towards their Jewish identity, their Jewish learning, having no idea how it's going to pan out. It may fall apart. And talking to people along those journey at the very early stages. What was your first Shabbos like? What was it like visiting a Beis Medrash for the first time? I think it would be so much more instructive for the Orthodox community. I don't need to be introduced to Jews who, I vaguely heard of, but now I know their full biography. But I would learn a lot from hearing what was it like for your college students visiting an Orthodox community for the first time. I think everyone could learn a lot from that, and you are uniquely suited to tell those stories. So that's really where I would start, highlighting those stories and getting back to basics. And you could complement it, I don't know, with more professional rabbis or information or any of that stuff. But really, the turning towards Jewish learning, the turning towards Jewish observance, Jewish commitment at the very early stages when we're filled with questions, filled with wonder, filled maybe with cynicism and questions and all those things. And how does that journey unfold? And checking back in with people. I think that's really, really compelling and something that is sorely lacking in the Jewish content space.
I appreciate that, and I actually think it's a beautiful idea. And maybe there are people that would love to partner and participate in something along those lines. Maybe you yourself, Dovid.
You heard it here first, listeners. You heard it here first. All Ari needs to get this started, as he said so many times, is a great deal of money. So please, listeners, you can forward him the money. Please just give 10% to 1840.
But I want to say one thing, David, in defense of the sort of the establishment, so to speak, because I think it's easy to pick on the establishment, and I'm a card carrying member of the sort of the cure of the outreach establishment as well, and a proud one. And I think that there's again an important distinction to be made and a dispositional reason why this little lacuna, this gap exists that you're talking about. Those who are deeply called in the trenches, those who are really every day. I mean, my average day, at the beginning of the college, you're standing outside of a freshman dining hall, flagging down Jewish Turks. And that's what I do. And I'm texting 18-year-old kids, and I'm a 45-year-old man, texting 18-year-old kids, will you please come and meet with me in the student union building and learn about our programs? And all the steps that takes, and the real, I call it hand-to-hand combat of deep, engaged, personal Jewish education. In many ways, that is a dispositionally opposing orientation to that, and then mass media creativity and production and dissemination. Right? You're talking when you're in the trenches, when you're just thinking about Bob and Lisa and whatever. Right?
I know all about the trenches, and I admire it is the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holy of holies of Jewish education, are those meetings one-on-one. But I know you don't believe that it is impossible or there is no space.
100%. There should and could be a space for it. I'm just saying, when you're looking at certain institutions,
And that's where I said the establishment has failed. The establishment has failed at harnessing mass media to create and begin Jewish journeys. They have, by and large, with the exception, more or less, of Aish.com, Chabad.org. They'll come up with 1,000 excuses. Rabbi Sachs, has done this well. I think David Wolpe, I think there are a lot of conservative rabbis who have done this fairly well. I'll call them out on it. I think David Wolpe, his writing, he uses mass media, he's in newspapers, has done a very beautiful job of this. Criticism is not on the trenches. My criticism are those who are so talented and have an eye for mass media. Why have the needs of this movement not yet been wedded in an efficient way towards mass media, particularly podcasts?
Yeah, it's a fair critique. Again, the defense of the establishment, and again, call it an excuse, would be that if you're working so hard to fine-tune the mechanics and the process of dealing with the trenches, which is unbelievably absorbing and consuming, really.
I would take that excuse seriously if I didn't see so many ill-conceived attempts to actually be on mass media. I would take that seriously. However, I know there are attempts, and I know they've tried, but they've done it not strategically. And shame on all of us. I'm not pointing at any one organization. They have not harnessed mass media in an efficient way to build entry points to begin Jewish journeys. And we've relied too heavily on the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and we haven't built on that Holy of Holies of the one-on-one relationship. And I think sometimes the holiness and intensity and beauty of that relationship has blinded us to the other entry points that we could possibly create to introducing the basics of Judaism to a wider audience. We should all take responsibility for this mistake, at least all of us, and myself included, who are involved in Jewish media and in Jewish outreach in one capacity or another.
Okay, so Dovid, there you go. It's a charge to all of us, yourself included. 1840s can't be the excuse either. There has to be those access points. I agree with you 100%. And again, I don't think we're living in this binary of either or. I think these are mutually compatible goals, and different people have different skills and talents. I appreciate the sentiment that I can participate maybe on both sides of the aisle, and I'm open to doing it. It's not just money. You said before we need money. We need thought partners. We need creative partners. We need people who have the expertise and the skills to, again, not only create these kinds of programs, but to actually get them into sort of the bloodstream of mass media. Not easy at all. There's, we live in a cacophonous,
it is not
cacophonous environment, and people are, flicking through at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And I wouldn't know how to do that. You're someone who does that quite well. I personally wouldn't know how. I could create the greatest content in the world. It might be, best seen by my mother, and even she took a while till she got on my own podcast. Now she's a big fan, but it took a couple years. So I'm not sure how. It's certainly easier said than done. And again, when you're living, breathing, and sleeping the Kodesh HaKadoshim, like you say, and thinking about getting the pizza from the pizza shop and the plates from Costco, and make sure the kid shows up with it. Right? Not simple to navigate both of those. And sometimes I would argue that a person shouldn't, because you need to focus on accomplishing and excelling in the area that you're primed to be dealing with. But yes, there is absolutely a place for that.
Yeah, but once you're running another podcast on the side as your fifth job, then you really don't have any excuses, which is why I so lovingly point this out. I always end my interview with more rapid-fire questions. I hope you will allow me. I added on...
Oh, no, that way I couldn't prepare? What do you mean?
I plan on doing the basics as well. I am curious if you have a favorite guest or episode from your history of Jews You Should Know.
But people always ask me this, and I tell them it's like your children, You have a favorite, but you can't admit it. No, it's hard to pick a favorite. The Doron Almog one that I mentioned to you before comes to mind. I had a remarkable conversation with Kalman Samuels, the founder of Shalva, in his beautiful place. Joshua Fast, the founder of Nefesh Ben Nefesh, was incredibly moving.
Sure.
I mean, there's been so many. I feel like I haven't listed any women, but there are some remarkable women that I've interviewed as well. There's so many, Dovid, and I really would need to go down the list and pick. I can't say a favorite, but a favorite 20 or so for sure.
That's okay. You mentioned Rabbi Sachs already. I'm curious, who are your white whales? Who are the guests you wish you were able to have?
For me right now, the number one is Rabbi Lau. I would absolutely love to interview Rabbi Lau, and I've come close many times. I was able to get my daughter to go into an audience to see him, but I couldn't get myself in. And, I've been at different events and occasions with him, but it's not easy because he doesn't really want to speak in an interview in English. So it's not simple to convince him to do that. That would be my number one right now. I'm just so riveted by him as a personality, as a figure, as living the youngest survivor of Buchenwald, and what he's done with his life, and the dynastic family from which he stems, and all of that surrounds him. I think is just profound, and I would love to be in his presence and interview him.
Let's get to some of the more familiar rapid fire questions for those 1840 listeners out there. I know you are an avid reader. What are your go-to book recommendations, particularly for your college students? I'm curious, who are just entering Judaism. Are there particular books that you like to recommend to open up people's hearts, whether specifically to Judaism or to religious thought in general?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of great books out there. Maybe not enough, but a lot of great ones. I'm doing this wonderful book journey right now, actually, through 1840, where I'm reading a great book about the conversion in Israel with Rabbi Eli Fisher, who was an old colleague of mine, actually, at the University of Maryland. He was the first JLIC rabbi there, but I knew him far before then as youngsters growing up. He was a couple years ahead of me in Baltimore, but that's been a lot of fun. But look, I think Rabbi Becher's Gateway to Judaism is a classic that's wonderful for introducing Judaism in both a sophisticated but sort of overarching way. Rabbi Tatz's books for those who are interested in a little bit of deeper kinds of thinking.
Yeah, what are the books that made you think differently about Jewish life and religious life in general?
No, but I wish I had an easy answer for that. I read a lot of shorter things. I read a lot of articles, a lot of journals, those kinds of things, more than I even read long form books. And I'll read anything from Mishpacha to Lehrhaus to whatever. I like to read all these kinds of things. I'm enamored with a lot of the writings that have come out of again Rabbi Sachs, and a lot of that world, the YU world. I find in general brings something unique that I think can benefit across the spectrum. I think it's starting to actually permeate, a certain type of organized thought, a certain type of articulated thought.
Particularly in print.
Yes, and I really enjoy that. I've been loving, actually, I had Ari Lamb on the show, and his grandfather. I told him I love to read the sermons.
One of a kind.
And they're just masterful, and they're so timely and timeless at the same time. You're reading about the Vietnam War, and you're there as it's unfolding, but it's also a message for today.
Relevant in 2023.
So I love those. And so I read a lot of things along those lines that really just kind of open my mind and so forth. But those aren't things that students are reading. Those are for my own nourishment, I would say.
I wonder, and we touched upon this as it relates to podcasts, but you have spent your life on the college campus. So I'm wondering if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical for as long as you needed to actually go back to school and enroll in a PhD program of your choice. What do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be?
I don't have the subject and title, but I have the general arena. I'm fascinated by the whole Kirov movement, by the Baal Tshuva movement. There have been some academic studies done of it, but I would love to do some sort of deep dive. My own parents were nourished from that world. They actually met in Rav Noach Weinberger's apartment. That was kind of my personal origin story. And so I would love to do some sort of study about that, whether it's contemporary, engaging kind of modern young people about, what moves them or could move them, or whether that's kind of doing more of a historical look or a sociological look. Sociology in general is something that's very, very interesting to me. I find it alternately fascinating and frustrating. We read a book through your book journey that I thought was brilliant, but also maddening in a certain way about conversion in Israel. You probably have it on your shelf.
When the State Winks?
When the State Winks, which I found, maddening and fascinating because it was just a really unique take on how to look at all the different parties involved in the mass, so to speak, conversion project in Israel. Maddening because I'm always sensitive to the notion of people inserting themselves in a narrative and judging that narrative at the same time. The notion of a person evaluating from their high perch, I find very distasteful in a certain way. And that's maybe why I would veer away from sociology, but I'm also fascinated by it at the same time.
My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules, especially people who have so many jobs like you and I. I think we're both competing with one another for how many side hustles can we amass. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
But then I would say I'm somewhere between better than you and worse than I should be. Um, having heard, your schedule many times. Look, I would love to be, that early riser. I have colleagues who do that.
Don't we all?
My parents do that, the whole Benjamin Franklin.
Yep.
My wife often points out to me, it's hard to do that when you go to sleep at 2:00 in the morning and so forth. So very often I have a hard time falling asleep. I'm very jealous of people who just hit the pillow and they're out. That's not me. I have a kind of a restless soul. I'm a very, an active mind, so to speak. And I just find it very difficult to fall asleep. And even if I go to bed early and I'm exhausted, somehow I have this kind of second wind that as soon as my head hits the pillow, sweeps across me, and that's frustrating. And so, I try to schedule things earlier in the morning than I want to, which forces me out of bed earlier than I would otherwise get up. So I loved, if I can get up at 7:00, that's amazing, and I feel unbelievable. It doesn't happen nearly as often as I'd like. Usually it's 8:30, and so forth. But I get to bed pretty late. Again, certainly later than I want to, and that's one of my next projects. You said you've been working on nutrition. I've also been working on nutritional eating, moving that direction. But I do say my next vista should probably be tackling my sleep patterns, because there are definitely strategies I'm sure that could help me improve that. But one bite at a time over here.
Rabbi Ari Koretzky, thank you so much for joining me and inviting me today to speak with you on the Jews You Should Know podcast.
Rabbi Dovid Bashevkin, thank you so much for joining as well.
This has been Ari Koretzky on Jews You Should Know. Please visit us at JewsYouShouldKnow.com and subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume podcasts. Find us on social media at Jews You Should Know. If you'd like to become a supporter of this podcast, we would greatly appreciate that, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Jews You Should Know. Finally, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review so that we can continue to grow and introduce many more people to Jews You Should Know.